In 1980, Toyota launched a new landcruiser. It was called the 60 Series, and it was built to do exactly what every landcruiser before it had been built to do: carry oil field engineers across the desert, haul livestock for Australian station owners, outlast the trail, outlast the road, outlast the buyer. Toyota engineered it the way they engineered the trucks they sold in Saudi Arabia and Kenya and the Northern Territory. A separate ladder frame, solid axles front and rear, a 4.2-liter inline-six that had been carried over almost unchanged from the previous generation, a 4-speed manual transmission, no power steering at launch, vinyl seats, roll-up windows, the kind of vehicle that an Australian cattle rancher could specify, take delivery of, and put into 30 years of daily service. The base price in the United States in 1980 was approximately $15,000. 10 years later, the same vehicle was selling for over $25,000 with leather seats, fuel injection, automatic transmission, power windows, and air conditioning. It was being parked in driveways in Greenwich, Connecticut, and Newport Beach, California. It was being driven to soccer practice. It was being chosen by buyers who would never take it off pavement, who had never owned a four-wheel drive vehicle in their lives, who had read about the Land Cruiser in the same magazines that were starting to feature a new word, used in a new way, to describe a category of vehicle that had not really existed when the 60 Series was first designed. The word was SUV. The truck had not changed. America had changed around it. How does a vehicle built for oil field engineers and Australian station owners end up as a status object in the wealthiest zip codes in the United States, while staying mechanically almost identical to what it was when it launched? To understand that, you have to start with what the Land Cruiser actually was when the 60 Series arrived. The Toyota Land Cruiser was, in 1980, primarily an export product. The vast majority of 60 Series production was destined for markets outside Japan and outside North America. Saudi Arabia bought thousands of them for desert work. Australia bought thousands more for the cattle stations and the mining operations of the Northern Territory and Western Australia. Africa bought them in large numbers for everything from United Nations peacekeeping operations to private safari operators to the Kenyan and South African governments. South America bought them for the oil and mining industries. Toyota had built the Land Cruiser, across the previous 3 decades, into the default vehicle of choice for any operation that needed a four-wheel drive truck that would work every day in conditions that would destroy a Range Rover or a Jeep within a few thousand miles. The 60 Series was the latest iteration of that proposition. It replaced the 40 Series and the 55 Series, both of which had been in production for years. The new 60 Series kept the same basic mechanical philosophy: body-on-frame construction, solid axles, part-time four-wheel drive. The carbureted 4.2-liter inline-six, designated the 2F, that had been carried over almost unchanged from the late 40 Series. The same transfer case, the same fundamental geometry that had been refined across 30 years of feedback from the actual professional users who ran these trucks for a living. The 2F engine deserves a specific note because the engine is a meaningful part of why the 60 Series eventually became a collector vehicle. The 2F was an inline-six 4.2 liters of displacement with a cast-iron block and a cast-iron head, pushrod valve train, and a single carburetor. By the standards of 1980 engineering, none of that was sophisticated. By the standards of long-term durability, almost all of it was correct. Cast iron is heavy, but it does not warp. Pushrod valve trains have fewer moving parts than overhead cam designs, which means fewer things to fail. A single carburetor is less efficient than fuel injection, but it can be rebuilt by hand on the side of a road in Saudi Arabia using a screwdriver and a clean rag. Toyota's engineers had built an engine that was deliberately understressed. The 2F produced 135 horsepower at 3,600 RPM, which was modest output for 4.2 liters of displacement. The understressing was the point. The engine was designed to run forever, not to win drag races. The transmission and transfer case followed the same philosophy. The standard transmission at launch was a 4-speed manual, which was upgraded to a 5-speed manual in 1982. The transfer case was a part-time system, which meant that the front drive shaft was disconnected during normal road driving, and the truck operated as rear-wheel drive until the driver actively engaged four-wheel drive. Part-time systems are mechanically simpler than full-time systems and produce less drivetrain wear during ordinary use. They also require the driver to pay attention to whether they are in two-wheel drive or four-wheel drive at any given moment, which was assumed to be acceptable for the audience the Land Cruiser was sold to. The engagement was done through a manual lever inside the cabin, and the front hubs had to be locked manually before four-wheel drive could be used. None of this was convenient. All of it was reliable. What was new was the body. The 60 Series was a four-door station wagon, not a two-door utility vehicle. It was longer than the 40 Series. It was wider. It had a real second row of seats and a third row that could fold for cargo. It had a tailgate that was conventional rather than a side-opening door. It had been designed deliberately to be more comfortable on long-distance highway drives than the 40 Series had been. The interior had carpet in some markets. Air conditioning was available as an option. Power steering became standard in most markets within the first 2 years of production. That was the engineering brief. Take the Land Cruiser's mechanical durability, the 30 years of accumulated off-road competence, the documented record of working in the hardest conditions on Earth, and put it in a body that a family could live with on a daily basis. The truck would still be fundamentally the same machine that an Australian cattle rancher would have specified. It would just also be a vehicle that could carry a family from Tokyo to a ski resort in the Japanese Alps without exhausting them. That dual purpose, when the 60 Series launched, was unusual. It was not yet a category. The vehicles that competed with it in 1980 were a small group, and most of them were either more utility-focused or more luxury-focused, but very few of them attempted to be both. In 1980, the American four-wheel drive market was small and fragmented. The Jeep Wagoneer was the most direct competitor. It had been in production since 1963, which made it the longest-running four-wheel drive station wagon in the world. By 1980, the Wagoneer had been refined into the Grand Wagoneer, with a leather interior, faux wood paneling on the body sides, and a base price that placed it firmly into the luxury vehicle segment. American Motors Corporation, which owned Jeep at the time, sold the Grand Wagoneer to a small number of wealthy buyers each year. It was the original American luxury SUV, before that phrase existed. It was also priced at approximately $16,000 in 1980, climbing toward $20,000 by the mid-80s, which placed it well above what the Land Cruiser cost. The Range Rover was the British competitor. It had launched in 1970, and it was, in 1980, sold in the United States only through gray market importers because Land Rover had not yet officially entered the American market. A small number of American buyers were willing to pay the premium and deal with the importation paperwork. Range Rover was, by reputation, the most luxurious off-road vehicle in the world. It was also famous for being mechanically fragile, with electrical systems that failed unpredictably, and an aluminum body that was expensive to repair. The Chevrolet Suburban and the Ford Bronco filled the volume space below the luxury options. Both were body-on-frame American trucks with four-wheel drive available. Both were sold primarily to buyers who actually needed the capability for work or rural living, and both were priced in the same general range as the Land Cruiser. The Suburban, in particular, had been in production since the 1930s, and it had a buyer base that had been loyal to it across multiple generations. The Land Cruiser sat in an unusual position relative to all of these. It was more capable off-road than the Suburban or the Bronco. It was more durable mechanically than the Range Rover. It was less luxurious than either the Range Rover or the Grand Wagoneer, and it was, by reputation, the choice of buyers who actually needed the capability and were willing to accept a less comfortable interior to get it. That positioning in 1980 was correctly aimed at the small American market that existed for serious off-road vehicles. Most of those buyers were rural. Many of them lived in mountain states or in the Pacific Northwest. Some of them were professionals who used the vehicle for work, ranchers and outfitters and Forest Service contractors. The buyer was not someone in Greenwich. The buyer was someone in Bozeman. The 60 Series sold to that buyer through the early 80s without doing anything unusual. Toyota was not advertising the truck heavily in the United States. The dealer network for the Land Cruiser was thin. The marketing budget that Toyota was putting into the American Land Cruiser program was a fraction of what Toyota was spending on the Camry or the Corolla because the volumes did not justify more. Then the 80s happened. The American luxury vehicle market in the 1980s went through a transformation that no one had predicted in 1980. The combination of rising affluence at the upper end of the income distribution, a generation of buyers who had grown up watching their parents drive sedans and station wagons, and who were looking for something different, and the emergence of a new vocabulary that described vehicles less by their function and more by their image, produced an entirely new vehicle category. The Range Rover entered the American market officially in 1987, and within 2 years it was a status object on the Upper East Side. The Jeep Grand Wagoneer, which had been a niche product for decades, became a cultural reference point. Magazines that had not previously covered four-wheel drive vehicles started running features about them. Movies started using them as visual shorthand for a particular kind of affluent rural authenticity. There was a specific cultural moment that helped this happen. Ralph Lauren's 1983 advertising campaign, which placed the Polo brand in the context of American country aesthetics, depicted four-wheel drive vehicles as part of a lifestyle that combined East Coast affluence with rural physical activity. The vehicles in those advertisements were not Cadillacs and Lincolns. They were Jeeps and Range Rovers and Land Cruisers. The clothing brand was selling an image that included the truck, and the truck became a wearable object in the same way that a barber jacket or a pair of riding boots was wearable. By the late 1980s, owning a four-wheel drive vehicle in Manhattan or Greenwich was as much a clothing decision as it was a transportation decision. The buyer was buying into a documented aesthetic that the fashion industry had been carefully constructing across the entire decade. The Land Cruiser was caught in the middle of this shift, without having tried to be. What Toyota had built was a working truck. What the American market was looking for was a working truck that could function as a status symbol. The 60 Series, by virtue of being expensive, foreign, four-wheel drive, mechanically serious, and carrying a name that already meant something to a certain kind of buyer, fit the description almost accidentally. The price had crept upward from the launch $15,000 to over $20,000 by the mid-80s, partly because Toyota was adding equipment, and partly because the dollar-yen exchange rate moved against Japanese exports through the decade after the Plaza Accord in 1985. By 1988, when the FJ62 variant launched in the United States with fuel injection, an automatic transmission, and a more refined interior, the base price was approaching $25,000. By 1990, the final North American year of production for the 60 Series, a fully equipped FJ62 was approaching $30,000, which was more than the average American household earned in a year. The buyer for that vehicle, at that price, in that year, was not the rancher in Bozeman. The buyer was, in many cases, a professional in a major American city, who had read about the Land Cruiser in a magazine, who knew that the truck had a reputation for crossing the Sahara, who wanted that reputation in his driveway, and who was perfectly comfortable with the fact that he would never actually take the vehicle off pavement. The Land Cruiser became a signal. It said its driver was the kind of person who could go anywhere, even if its driver actually went only between the office and the country club. There is a specific data point that captures the shift. In 1980, Toyota sold approximately 7,000 Land Cruisers in the United States. By 1989, that figure had climbed past 16,000. The volume increase was modest by the standards of mainstream Toyota products, where Camry sales were measured in the hundreds of thousands. But the price per unit had nearly doubled across the same period, which meant that the Land Cruiser's contribution to Toyota's American luxury revenue had climbed several times faster than its unit volume. Toyota was discovering, through the 60 Series' accidental commercial trajectory, that there was a market in the United States for an expensive Japanese four-wheel drive vehicle, and that the buyers in that market were not the buyers Toyota had originally designed the truck for, Toyota noticed. The 60 Series itself, mechanically, barely changed across its decade of production. The frame was the same, the axles were the same, the transfer case was the same, the basic engine, the 2F gasoline inline-six, was carried from the launch year through 1987 and was then replaced by the larger and more refined 3F and 3FE versions for the FJ62 from 1988 onward. The 3F was a meaningful upgrade. It produced 155 horsepower instead of the 2F's 135, and it was fuel-injected rather than carbureted. But the architecture was the same. It was an inline-six push rod with a cast-iron block and head, designed to operate in dust and heat for hundreds of thousands of miles without complaint. The 3F was a refinement of the 2F, not a replacement. The diesel options available outside North America followed the same pattern. The 2H diesel inline-six was offered for the BJ60 and HJ60 variants. The larger 12HT turbo diesel arrived in 1985 for the HJ61 variant, marketed primarily in markets like Australia and the Middle East, where diesel fuel was cheaper and where buyers genuinely needed the extra torque for towing and load carrying. North America never received the diesel options. Toyota's market research had concluded that American buyers would not pay extra for diesel, and the variants stayed out of the U.S. market for the entire production run. Where Toyota did invest was in the interior and the equipment list. The North American FJ62 added power windows, power locks, air conditioning that actually worked in Phoenix in August, cruise control, a 4-speed automatic transmission, larger side mirrors, quad rectangular headlights instead of the FJ60's round ones, a redesigned dashboard with a more conventional layout, cloth interior trim that was more comfortable than the vinyl that had defined the earlier production. By 1990, the FJ62 had become genuinely livable as a daily driver, in a way the FJ60 had not been at launch. But the 60 series never became luxurious. It did not get leather as standard. It did not get wood trim. It did not get the kind of interior that the Range Rover or the Grand Wagoneer offered. It did not get a high-end audio system. The cabin remained, in 1990, fundamentally the same kind of cabin that had been in the truck in 1980. Plastic dashboard, cloth seats. Functional but unrefined, the truck was still, mechanically and visually, a working vehicle. It was just being sold at luxury prices to luxury buyers. That gap between what Toyota was building and what the American market was paying for was the entire commercial story of the 60 series in the United States. The truck did not pretend to be a luxury vehicle. The truck simply happened to occupy the position the market was assigning to it, regardless of what the truck itself was actually offering. The successor would change that. The 80 series Land Cruiser arrived for the 1991 model year, replacing the 60 series globally except in Venezuela, where local production continued through 1992. The 80 series was a different proposition. It was the first Land Cruiser designed with the American luxury SUV buyer as a primary target rather than as an incidental customer. The exterior was rounder, more contemporary, less obviously a working truck. The interior added wood trim, leather seating surfaces, dual-zone climate control, and a level of soundproofing that the 60 series had never approached. The drivetrain was upgraded with full-time four-wheel drive instead of the part-time system the 60 series had carried for a decade. A new 4.5-liter inline-six replaced the 3F, with more power, more refinement, and a quieter operation at highway speed. The 80 series, in other words, was the Land Cruiser that Toyota built once they understood what the American market actually wanted from the vehicle. It still carried the Land Cruiser mechanical philosophy. It still had a separate frame. It still had solid axles, at least at the rear. It still had the same fundamental durability that the 60 series had inherited from the 40 series. But it had been reshaped, deliberately, to fit the buyer that the 60 series had attracted accidentally. The pricing reflected the repositioning. The 80 series launched at approximately $36,000, climbing toward $45,000 for fully equipped versions by the mid-1990s. The Lexus LX450, which was a rebadged 80 series sold through the new Lexus dealer network, launched in 1996 at over $50,000 and confirmed what the market had already been telling Toyota for years. The Land Cruiser was now a luxury vehicle, and Toyota was going to charge for it accordingly. The 60 series, in retrospect, was the bridge between the Land Cruiser as a working tool and the Land Cruiser as a luxury status object. It had launched as the first, and it had ended as the second, without changing what it actually was. America had simply moved underneath it. The 60 series was not a luxury vehicle. The 60 series was a working truck whose buyers, by the end of its production run, were treating as a luxury vehicle in a market that was simultaneously inventing the category that would define the next 30 years of American automotive design. That distinction matters because it explains both why the 60 Series sold the way it did when it was new, and why it has become a collector vehicle in the way it has in the current market. In the current used market, a clean FJ60 or FJ62 is no longer affordable. Driver quality examples start around $25,000. Show quality FJ62S in original configuration regularly cross $50,000. The auction market has produced sales above $100,000 for top-tier examples, and a single 1989 FJ62 sold for $154,000 at auction in 2024, which is several times what the truck cost anew, even at its peak 1990 pricing. The 60 Series has become one of the most consistently appreciating Japanese vehicles of the 1980s, alongside the Toyota Supra and the Nissan Skyline GT-R, but for a different reason. The Supra and the Skyline appreciated because they were genuinely high-performance vehicles that became cultural objects through media and motorsport. The 60 Series appreciated because it became a documented record of a transitional moment in American automotive culture, when working trucks and luxury vehicles were merging into a single category that did not yet have a name. A buyer who picks up an FJ62 in 2026 is buying a piece of that history. The mechanical proposition is straightforward. The truck still runs. The engine, which was over-engineered when it was new, is still over-engineered after 35 years of service. The frame is still rigid. The transfer case still works. The aftermarket parts ecosystem is enormous, sustained by the global landcruiser community that has been working on these trucks continuously since the 1980s. An owner who knows what they are doing can keep an FJ62 running indefinitely, and many of them do, with original drivetrains crossing 400,000 miles regularly. The ownership reality is more demanding than the reputation suggests, however. The 60 Series predates the era of computer-controlled engine management. The carbureted FJ60 requires periodic carburetor adjustment, points and timing checks, and the kind of tune-up procedures that have not been part of mainstream automotive ownership for 30 years. The fuel-injected FJ62 is more straightforward, but its early electronic systems are now older than most of the mechanics who would otherwise be qualified to diagnose them. Body rust is a documented problem, particularly in salt belt examples, where the boxed frame and the rear quarter panels are the most common areas of corrosion. The truck is durable mechanically, but it is not maintenance-free, and the buyer who takes one on as a daily driver has to be prepared to learn things about the vehicle that the buyer of a contemporary Toyota would never have to learn. The cultural proposition is more complicated. The buyer who pays $50,000 for a clean FJ62 today is not buying it for the same reason the buyer in Greenwich paid $30,000 for it in 1990. The Greenwich buyer was paying for status. The current buyer is paying for authenticity, for the documented record of what the truck represented before the category around it became saturated with imitators. The same vehicle sold to two different buyers in two different decades for two different reasons, in a market that is still trying to figure out exactly what it wants from a luxury SUV. The truck did not change, the buyers did. And the gap between what Toyota was building and what the market was paying for is the entire story of the 60 Series landcruiser. The story of an honest working vehicle that became, accidentally, the founding document of an entirely new category of American luxury automobile. Now, click on this next video to see the American luxury car that faced the opposite problem entirely. The full-size sedan that was built with no innovation at all, that carried the same body-on-frame architecture for almost 2 decades, that Ford deliberately refused to update, and that became, by the end of its run, one of the most beloved American cars of its generation, specifically because it never changed.